Ned Price, he is an MSNBC national security analyst. He was a special assistant to President Obama. Jeff, let me start with you. We turn our focus once again to the summer of 2016. Let's pull up the timetable here if we could. June the 3rd, Donald Trump Jr. was pitched some dirt on Hillary Clinton and her campaign. June the 7th, candidate Donald Trump teased a major speech on the Clintons. June the 9th, this infamous Trump Tower meeting takes place with a number of Russians in Trump Tower. June 27th, we hear that clarion call from President Trump to the Russians to find those 30,000 plus Hillary Clinton emails. And then June the 27th, that same day, Russians attempt to hack the Clinton emails and the Democratic National Committee. Put this meeting in focus for us once again here. How has the circumstances changed here as a result of what we've learned this week?
Well, look, David, and we should say that the president asserts he did nothing wrong here, says that, apart from what Michael Cohen says, that he knew about this meeting in advance and that he was told about it by his son, Donald Trump Jr. That certainly wasn't the case. I'll tell you, talking to people both here at the White House and on the Hill, they seem to think that the earliest movement in this entire unfolding drama could come on the Donald Trump Jr. part of this, since you have Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee calling for him to testify in public under oath about what he knew and what he told his father and when. Remember, Donald Trump Jr. Sat behind closed doors and told congressional investigators clearly and unequivocally that he did not tell his dad, then candidate Donald Trump, ahead of time about this meeting. Of course, the problem here is that Donald Trump Jr. has a history of making false and misleading statements about this now infamous Trump Tower meeting. He initially said he had no role in setting up a meeting with Russian nationals that were relevant to the campaign. That, of course, was not true. He then said the meeting was all about this issue of Russian adoptions, which also turned out not to be true when the email came out showing that this was really about the transfer of damaging information about Hillary Clinton's campaign. So we should say that Donald Trump Jr.'s attorney has put out a statement saying that they stand by the credibility of the information that Donald Trump Jr. provided to that congressional committee, but lying to Congress is a crime that comes with up to 5 years in prison, David.
Ned Price, let's keep our focus on Capitol Hill. The House Intelligence Committee is in total disarray. There were two dueling reports on Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. There was the majority report and the minority report. Let me read a little bit here from the minority report, the one that was prepared by Democrats on that committee. While the committee has not pursued leads to determine who called Trump Jr. at this critical time from a blocked number, Corey Lewandowski told the committee that Mr. Trump's primary residence has a blocked phone line. Despite the minority's repeated efforts to obtain home or cell phone records for then-candidate Trump to determine whether the blocked call was Trump Jr.'s father, the majority was unwilling to pursue the matter. I just want to read here quickly as well a statement from Donald Trump Jr.'s attorney, Alan Futterfuss. He's with the Trump Organization. Donald Trump Jr. has been professional and responsible throughout the Mueller and congressional investigations. We are very confident of the accuracy and reliability of the information that's been provided by Mr. Trump Jr. and on his behalf. Ned, I want to get your perspective on this. You hear from the Democrats there. They weren't satisfied with the information they were able to get from Donald Trump Jr. Do you sense a political turn here in light of what we've learned this week from that report about what Michael Cohen might have known when?
Well, what I sense, David, is that minority report is alluding to a possibility that many of us have seen for quite some time now. There has been at least a circumstantial case from what we have known long before what we learned from Michael Cohen this week, that the president, Donald Trump, was aware of that Trump Tower meeting as it was all going down. Of course, you mentioned the block call to John Jr. that took place just before this meeting, as mentioned in that House Minority Report. But we also have to keep in mind the speech that President Trump promised, in which he, right after learning of this Russian offer, planned to deliver a speech with dirt on Hillary Clinton. The fact that Steve Bannon has said that it would be unimaginable that the president was unaware of this, and the shifting explanations all along. If there really was nothing to this meeting, if President Trump, then candidate Trump, was not aware of it, why the consistent effort to sweep this under the rug? Why the consistent effort to change the narrative around this meeting that investigators are finding so pivotal at this moment?
Elena, I just want you to step back for us, if you would, just give us some perspective on how this relationship, this dynamic between President Trump and Michael Cohen, who for so long was the president's confidant, his attorney, his so-called fixer. This has been a week in which that relationship is already turned very dramatically here, I think you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a political reporter, David, I'm most interested in how this plays with voters ahead of midterm elections. 101 days away now, but I'm seeing a parallel to what Rudy Giuliani said earlier this summer, which is when he said that Michael Cohen was honest with the utmost of credibility. I would hear the same thing constantly from House Republican sources in particular. Today, talking to people, you know, what is kind of the read on your members after this week ahead of midterm? And they say, you know what, Michael Cohen has always had credibility issues. And at this point, when it, you know, vis-a-vis the Don Jr. meeting, this is all he said, she said. So I think until, you know, this, if and when the Senate Intel Committee subpoenas Don Jr. to come back and testify once more and say under oath that his father did not know about this meeting, I don't see the political ramifications for the Republican Party at this moment.
Jeff, I want to stick with this, the political implications of this. We have seen this play out in the court of public opinion with flair and flourish this week, starting with the playing of that tape on national television in real time. Lanny Davis, Michael Cohen's lawyer there, presenting CNN with the tape. We listened to it with him, with Chris Cuomo and Lanny Davis in real time. To Elena's point there, these are thorny issues, broadly speaking, but there have been points of real drama here this week. What's your sense of the effect that's having politically?
Well, certainly those in the president's base will probably be unmoved by this, in part because just the nature of our politics today. You have such tribalism, and then laid over that, you have the cult of personality surrounding the president. That said, though, and just in my conversations with some of the people in the president's inner circle, you do get the sense that there is this fear and the sense of frustration surrounding this overall Cohen investigation in a way that does not exist with the overall Russia investigation, in part because, you know, whereas the president could really shut down if he wanted, or narrow the focus of the Russia investigation by putting pressure on the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, or perhaps even getting rid of him, he can't really do that with such ease with the Cohen investigation, since it's being carried out by the prosecutor's office in the Southern District of New York. So that's why you get the sense that the people in the president's orbit and the president himself sense that there's a more direct threat here posed by the Cohen investigation than by the overall Mueller investigation, David.
Ned Price, let's dovetail this with the president's effort to have a sequel to his summit in Helsinki. John Bolton, the national security advisor, was asked to courier an invitation to Moscow to have Vladimir Putin come to the United States. This week we heard from John Bolton saying it would be advisable for that summit not to take place until the new year. And then we heard this from the president of Russia himself, from Vladimir Putin. Let's take a listen.
We are ready to invite President Trump to Moscow. Be my guest. He has such an invitation, and I told him that. I am ready to go to Washington as well. I repeat once again, if the right conditions for work are created.
Let's focus on that last clause there, if we could, Ned, if the right conditions are created. This was the second big summit where there was a lot of attention, a lot of emphasis on just the fact that the meeting itself was taking place. What is this back and forth, this invitation from President Putin here at the end of the week tell you about the point of this second meeting that would take place, I guess, now in 2019?
Well, it tells me, David, that Vladimir Putin has a very different vision of a potential second person-to-person meeting with Donald Trump. You have to remember that the invitation was extended by John Bolton just last week. It was then rescinded by the White House, claiming that they did not want to do it while the Mueller probe was ongoing. Now, the thing that struck a lot of us was the fact that, of course, the White House knew the Mueller probe would be ongoing when they initially extended this invitation to Vladimir Putin, so their explanation doesn't make sense. What does make sense, however, is Vladimir Putin's perspective on all this, and from his perspective, this sure looks like a naked power play on his part, an effort to say, you know what, I don't need to go to the White House, but President Trump, why don't you come here to Moscow? In a sense, Vladimir Putin, it looks like, it sure sounds like, is trying to summon President Trump to Moscow, to bring him to his turf. He said, I'll go to Washington, but only if the conditions are right, but President Trump is certainly welcome here. And we heard from Sarah Huckabee Sanders yesterday, the White House press secretary, that President Trump would indeed entertain a visit to Moscow if the invitation was forthcoming. So it seems like this could be something in the offing in the coming months.
Lana, last question here. There was so much back and forth after that meeting in Helsinki about the degree to which the administration takes seriously the threat that Russia poses here as we approach the midterms. 19 months into this administration, the National Security Council finally sits down and discusses the threat of Russian interference going ahead. Just window dressing here. What do you make of the timing of that meeting, which took place yesterday?
What I think is that when it comes to election security, I've heard from voters most recently on an Alabama coal mine this week that ultimately Russians' interference in this election was for good. And I think this is a narrative you're going to see among Trump's staunchest supporters moving ahead. They said what the Russians revealed through their DNC hack was ultimately true and good for the country because it got us a leader who is willing to fight for the United States. So again, I think we still haven't quite reached that point, David, where something is unable to be spinned by this president's base. What that means for November, I'm not entirely sure, but it's certainly interesting as a reporter to try and look for when that line, in fact, will be drawn.
That is just astonishing reporting there, Elena Plott, that people are happy or think that it was beneficial that the Russians intervened back in 2016. Elena Plott of The Atlantic, thank you very much. My thanks to Ned Price, my colleague Jeff Bennett as well. Well, 18 charges, 35 potential witnesses, and up to 10 years in prison. Up next, what to watch for in former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort's upcoming trial, and how concerned should the White House be about what's going to unfold inside that Virginia courtroom. Welcome back. I'm David Gura. On Tuesday, the trial for prisoner 000-45343, that is when Paul Manafort will begin. We have the list of the 35 witnesses the government will call to testify against President Trump's former campaign chairman. Paul Manafort is charged with 18 counts of bank and tax fraud. Jurors in the Virginia case expected to hear from bankers, from accountants, some car dealers as well. Paul Manafort is also expected to face a second criminal trial in Washington in September. That'll be on charges relating to witness tampering in connection with his lobbying work. Joining me now, Jill Wine-Banks, former Watergate prosecutor and an MSNBC contributor. Jill, let me start with what you're going to be watching for here. This is a trial that's been postponed. Judge T.S. Ellis said that in light of the fact that thousands of pages of documents related to Rick Gates and his accountant were dumped here on the defense, they had to postpone this trial by a few days. It makes me think this is a documents trial we're going to see here. What are you going to be watching for?
It's going to be an interesting trial, and of course these documents all stemmed from Paul Manafort, so he's very familiar with them, and his accountants are familiar with them because they prepared some of them. But it gave enough time for his lawyers to really become familiar with them since he changed lawyers. His other lawyers would have been familiar with them. I expect trial to take two parts. The first part will be showing what his expenditures were, and he had a very lavish lifestyle. He spent $850,000 for suits, $850,000, and almost as much for landscaping. He spent $500,000 to landscape one of his many homes. So we're going to see how much he spent, and then we're going to look at the tax returns and how much he reported as income. Obviously, he didn't have enough income reported to cover those expenses. So then the next part will be to show that he had all this unreported income that went into foreign bank accounts, and then we'll look at where it came from. And it came from his work in Ukraine, working for the pro-Russian forces who were trying to undermine the independent Ukrainian government. So he's going to look bad in terms of how much he was spending and how unrelatable that is to the average person, and then also in terms of the kind of work that he was doing. So that's what I expect to see, and ultimately what it shows is the kind of people that Donald Trump surrounded himself with. He promised us the best, and he produced Paul Manafort, he produced Michael Cohen, he produced Rudy Giuliani. These are not the best people, and that's what people will ultimately see.
Jill, suffice to say that the president and his legal team are going to be watching this closely. Rudy Giuliani was on CNN last evening. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about this trial.
They're putting Manafort in solitary confinement, which sounds more like Russia than the U.S., in order to get him to break. And maybe they've succeeded in cracking this guy and getting him to lie. I don't know. I'm not sure of that. Well, I shouldn't say it.
Then don't say it.
Sound words there from Chris Cuomo to Rudy Giuliani. Don't say it. But Jill, I want to ask you just about how unorthodox this case is. We have that list of 35 witnesses. I mentioned that at the top. You have a judge here who's drawing very clear lines about what's supposed to be discussed in this trial. He doesn't want Russia to be discussed here. Prosecutors said they don't intend to bring up Russia or allegations of collusion in the course of this trial. How difficult is that going to be? You've been a prosecutor. How hard is it to stay within the lines when you have dueling trials like this?
It's not hard at all. I think they have such compelling evidence of his guilt that they can really limit themselves to his expenditures and his income and to the sources of his income. They do have to talk about the pro-Russia government that he was supporting, only because it helps to understand where he got his money and why it was such large sums. But I also want to address what Rudy Giuliani said. He was not put in solitary confinement. That's just a made-up fact. He was living very luxuriously. And if you remember, in prison I'm talking about, he complained, or his lawyers complained, that they couldn't prepare him for trial. They wanted him moved closer. And then he said, oh, no, I really want to stay here, because it turned out that he had quite a nice setup with computers and all sorts of televisions, and he was living very well there. And so he didn't really want to be moved to D.C., where it would be easy for him to work with his lawyers, but where he would not be living except in a normal prison. So I don't think it's fair to say anything bad about how he was being kept. He was being kept in a very, very, almost as lavish as his own private life, at least for a jail.
Jill, before I let you go, people turn to you for your incisive legal opinions. They also have come to love the pins and brooches that you wear as well. You have quite a following on Twitter and Instagram looking at hashtag Jill's pin. Tell us what you're wearing today. We're talking about $850,000 suits. Let's focus on Sartoria here a little bit. What are you wearing? Tell us about the pin today.
Today's pin came from a Twitter follower, and it is a very beautiful blue wave. It is a big blue wave, and that's what I'm expecting in November. It's the only thing that's going to save our democracy from what is happening, from the children being separated from their families, from a 6-year-old girl being assaulted and told that she had to sign a document. This is a 6-year-old who is Guatemalan and probably does not read English, who put her initial on saying she was responsible for staying away from her assaulter. These are things that cannot continue, and we can't continue to have the president saying that facts don't matter, don't believe what you see and hear. I believe what I heard on the tape. He said cash, and he knew about the payments. So I think we need to be focusing on that, and that's what should motivate Democrats and Republicans to support the candidates who will not allow this to continue.
All right, Jill, signifier of the day. Wine Banks, thank you very much as always. I appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
All right, the eye of the storm, allegations of sexual misconduct against the head of CBS that stretch back decades. That's next.